The calm before the storm. Jason Carter had grown accustomed to the battles that came with his profession. As a prominent civil rights attorney, he'd made a career out of standing against injustices and fighting systemic racism. He had spent countless hours in the courtroom, defending those who could not defend themselves, tearing down walls of prejudice brick by brick. Tonight, as he drove home from another successful day in court, Jason felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, a rare but fleeting victory in a long, arduous journey. The suburban neighborhood he called home came into view. Its wide, tree-lined streets and neatly manicured lawns were a comforting sight. His house, a modern two-story structure that stood proudly on the corner, was his sanctuary. His wife, Kira, would be waiting for him inside, likely helping their two children, Jordan and Maya, with their homework or reading them a bedtime story. This was the life he'd worked hard for, a life he had earned and cherished deeply. As he turned into his driveway, Jason let out a deep, contented sigh. He parked his luxury SUV, savoring the silence of the moment. Then, suddenly, blinding headlights filled his rearview mirror, snapping him back into a harsh reality. The unmistakable blue and red lights of a police car flickered behind him, piercing the darkness. He squinted, momentarily disoriented, as two police officers stepped out of their cruiser, their expressions cold and suspicious. "Step out of the vehicle," one of the officers commanded. The officer's voice carried a tone of authority that left no room for negotiation. Jason's pulse quickened, his instincts screaming at him to proceed cautiously. He had dealt with cases like this. Young black men pulled over in affluent neighborhoods, treated as criminals simply for existing in a space deemed out of bounds by some unwritten rule. Jason's lawyer mind kicked in. He knew his rights. He knew exactly how to handle this situation, yet there was a part of him, deep and visceral, that felt the weight of vulnerability. He was not in the courtroom now. He was a black man in his own driveway, facing officers who seemed ready for a confrontation. Despite his inner turmoil, he forced himself to remain calm. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, raised his hand slightly, and stepped out of the car. The cool night air brushed against his skin as he stood beside his vehicle, hands visible, hoping his posture would communicate compliance. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, laced with the subtle authority that came from years of experience. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle in the area matching this description," the second officer stated flatly, his gaze steely and unyielding. Jason felt a surge of disbelief. This was his car, registered in his name, parked in his own driveway. "This is my vehicle. My ID and registration are in the glove compartment," he explained, keeping his tone measured, even as a simmering anger stirred beneath the surface. "I live here. This is my home." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The first officer, a stocky man with a hardened expression, took a step closer, his hand hovering near his gun. "Move away from the car," he barked, his voice laced with suspicion. There was a cold edge to his tone, as though he had already decided Jason was guilty. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, but he knew better than to argue. He raised his hands a little higher, slowly backing away from his car, trying to convey compliance. Just then, the porch light flickered on, and Kira appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of their home. Her face was etched with confusion and worry, her voice trembling as she called out, "Jason, what's going on?" "Go inside, Kira," he replied, his voice steady, but carrying an unspoken warning. He didn't want her involved in this. He wanted to shield her from the ugliness unfolding on their front lawn, to protect her from the cold hostility radiating from the officers. But the officers weren't paying attention to Kira. Instead, one of them reached for Jason, roughly shoving him against the side of the car. The metallic frame pressed into his side, and he felt a sharp pain shoot through his ribs as the officer twisted his arm behind his back. "What do you think you're doing?" The officer sneered, his voice hot against Jason's ear. "Think you can just drive around in whatever car you want, in whatever neighborhood you want?" "This is my car," Jason gritted out, fighting to keep his composure. "My home. My family is inside. I am not doing anything wrong." But his words were ignored. The officer's grip tightened, and Jason felt the sharp, unforgiving bite of handcuffs around his wrists, the cold metal locking him into place. He heard Kira's voice rise, frantic and desperate as she pleaded with the officers, her voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. "This is a mistake." Kira's voice cut through the air, her tone thick with anger and disbelief. "This is his car. He's an attorney. What are you doing? Get back inside, ma'am, or you'll be next." One of the officers snapped, casting a brief dismissive glance in her direction. Kira froze, her face a mask of fear and frustration, her eyes wide with disbelief as she looked back at Jason. Through the chaos, Jason caught a glimpse of his children's faces, pressed against the window, their innocent eyes filled with confusion and fear. His heart shattered as he imagined the questions racing through their young minds. How would he explain this to them? How could they possibly understand this nightmare? The officers hauled him to his feet, roughly shoving him toward the squad car. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to stand tall, to refuse to give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. As he was pushed into the back seat, he glanced at Kira one last time, his silent vow to her echoing in his mind. "This isn't over. I will make this right." As the car pulled away, leaving his family standing on the front lawn, Jason felt a cold determination settle over him. This would not be the end of his story. This would be the beginning of a battle, a fight for justice that would not only clear his name, but would expose the very system he had spent his life fighting against. And in that moment, Jason Carter made a silent vow. He would not let this go. Not for himself, not for his family, and not for anyone who had ever felt the weight of injustice pressing down on them. This fight was personal now, and he was ready to see it through to the end. The weight of injustice. The ride to the police station was filled with a suffocating silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional murmur from the officers up front. Jason sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists still stinging from the bite of the handcuffs, his mind racing with disbelief and anger. He'd spent his career battling for justice, for fair treatment, for the right of every person to be seen as innocent until proven guilty. Yet here he was, treated like a criminal in his own driveway. He glanced out of the tinted window, watching as familiar landmarks of his neighborhood faded into a blur. His mind drifted back to the look on Kira's face, the fear in her eyes as she watched him being handcuffed and shoved into the police car. And the kids, their tiny, innocent faces pressed against the window, trying to comprehend why their father was being taken away. His chest tightened with a painful mix of humiliation and anger. What would this do to them? How could he explain to Jordan and Maya, who looked up to him as their hero, that their father had been reduced to this, stripped of his dignity, his status, his humanity, simply because of the color of his skin? As they neared the police station, Jason took a deep breath, attempting to steady himself. He needed to stay calm, to keep his wits about him. He knew the drill, knew that any hint of aggression, any display of frustration, would only make things worse. He had fought too hard, achieved too much, to let these officers rob him of his composure. The car finally came to a stop, and the officers opened the door, yanking him out with unnecessary force. He winced as they pulled him roughly, the metal handcuffs biting into his wrists. Jason held his head high, his face impassive, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. The fluorescent lights of the police station were harsh, casting a cold glow over everything. As they led him inside, he felt the eyes of the officers and staff on him, some glancing with surprise, others with barely concealed indifference. A few seemed to recognize him, the famous civil rights attorney who had taken on the police department on more than one occasion. But there was no acknowledgement, no sign of recognition in their eyes. Jason was brought to the booking area, where an officer with a clipboard glanced up at him briefly, then looked away as if dismissing him as yet another suspect in a long line of detainees. The officer's tone was indifferent, almost robotic, as he began the standard questioning. "Name?" the officer asked, barely glancing up. "Jason Carter," he replied, his voice steady. "Occupation?" Jason hesitated for a moment. "Attorney," he answered, a bitter irony lacing his tone. The officer didn't react, simply jotting down the information before moving on with the rest of the procedure. They took his fingerprints, pressing his hands onto the ink pad and then onto the cold, unforgiving paper. Jason had guided clients through this process countless times, advising them to stay calm, to be patient. Now he found himself on the other side, experiencing firsthand the dehumanizing nature of the system he had fought against. After the booking was complete, they led him to a holding cell, the metal door clanging shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his mind. He sat on the hard, cold bench, his mind racing, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger, fear, and frustration. How had it come to this? How could the system he had fought to improve turn against him so easily, reducing him to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of these officers? Hours passed in that cell, each minute dragging on like an eternity. The harsh fluorescent lights never dimmed, casting a cold, clinical glow over everything, leaving no room for comfort, no space for dignity. Jason closed his eyes, trying to block out the blinding light, trying to focus on what he would do next. His mind drifted back to Kira and the kids. He knew she would be doing everything she could to get him out. Kira was just as fierce as he was, a lawyer in her own right who had spent years advocating for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She would not let this go quietly. Jason took solace in that thought, in the knowledge that he wasn't alone in this battle. He lost track of time, his thoughts a whirlwind of memories, anger, and determination. Then, finally, the heavy metal door creaked open, and a familiar face appeared. Detective James Caldwell, a colleague Jason had worked with in the past, stepped into the holding area. Caldwell's face was a mixture of anger and sympathy, his eyes filled with the weight of what had transpired. He glanced around, making sure they were alone, before speaking in a low, steady voice. "Jason, I just found out about this. I came as soon as I could," Caldwell said, his tone apologetic. He knew Jason's reputation, knew the battles he had fought for justice, and he seemed genuinely disturbed by the situation. Jason looked up, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. "James, I didn't expect to see you here." Caldwell sighed, shaking his head. "I didn't expect to be here either. This whole thing, it's absurd. I've already started pulling strings to get you out. This is a clear case of mistaken identity, but I'm afraid it's more than that." Jason's jaw clenched. He had known all along that this was about more than just a mistake. This was about prejudice, about a system that was quick to judge, quick to cast suspicion on anyone who didn't fit a certain mold. "It's not just a mistake, James. This is about who I am, who they think I am." Caldwell nodded, his face grim. "I know, and I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. But for now, I need you to keep your head down. Let me handle this. We're going to get you out, but it's going to take time." Jason exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He trusted Caldwell, knew he was one of the few officers who genuinely cared about justice. But the humiliation lingered, the sense of betrayal gnawing at him. This wasn't just about getting out of a holding cell. This was about exposing the very system that had placed him here. "Thank you, James," Jason said quietly. "But I won't let this go. They need to be held accountable for what they did, for what they tried to do." Caldwell nodded, understanding the determination in Jason's voice. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you. Just be careful, all right? This fight isn't going to be easy." Jason gave a slight nod, his mind already racing with plans. This was just the beginning. He would turn this injustice into a catalyst for change, a rallying cry for all those who had been silenced, mistreated, and marginalized. As Caldwell left the cell, Jason felt a renewed sense of purpose. This experience had left him shaken, but it had also ignited a fire within him. He would not rest until the truth was out, until those who had wronged him were held accountable. This was no longer just a battle for his own dignity. It was a fight for justice, for every person who had been unjustly targeted, every life disrupted by prejudice and bias. And Jason Carter was ready to fight that fight with everything he had. A family in waiting. As Jason sat in his holding cell, another battle was quietly unfolding back at his home. Kira paced the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Her children, Jordan and Maya, had finally fallen asleep after hours of confusion and tears, but their worried faces lingered in her mind. She had spent the evening trying to comfort them, reassuring them that Daddy would be home soon, but she couldn't silence the trembling in her own voice. As she looked out the window into the quiet, empty street, Kira felt a wave of helplessness she hadn't experienced in years. She had always believed in the strength of her family, the power of their love, and the certainty of their place in this world. But tonight, that certainty was shattered. It wasn't just about Jason being detained. It was the cruel reminder that no amount of success or status could shield them from the biases embedded deep in the system. Kira's mind raced as she scrolled through her contacts, stopping at the names of lawyers, friends, and colleagues who might be able to help. The first person she called was her friend Sarah, a fellow attorney who had worked alongside her in several advocacy cases. The phone rang twice before Sarah picked up, her voice warm but laced with concern. "Kira, it's late. Is everything all right?" Kira took a deep breath, her voice steady but strained. "Sarah, it's Jason. They arrested him tonight, in front of our house, in front of the kids. It's a nightmare. They accused him of driving a stolen car." "His own car, Sarah." A gasp came from the other end of the line, followed by a string of shocked exclamations. "Are you serious? It's insane. Jason, arrested, in his own driveway." "Yes," Kira said, her voice tightening as she fought back tears. "And they didn't care who he was, didn't care that he's an attorney who fights these very injustices. They treated him like a criminal. It was humiliating." Sarah's tone softened, filling with compassion. "Listen, Kira, we're not going to let this go. This isn't just about Jason. It's about every person of color who's been treated this way. I'll start reaching out to contacts at the courthouse, see if we can get him released as quickly as possible." Kira nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. Just hearing someone else validate her anger, her pain, made her feel a little less alone. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be forever grateful." As she hung up, Kira took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She knew that Sarah was right. This was about more than just their family. It was about justice, about standing up against a system that had wronged countless others. But at that moment, all she wanted was for Jason to be home, to hold her children and tell them that everything would be all right. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the empty street, the darkness outside mirroring the turmoil within her. She thought back to the early days of her and Jason's relationship, how they had fallen in love over shared dreams of making the world a better place. They had been young and idealistic, determined to change the world together, one case at a time. She had known from the start that Jason's passion for justice was unyielding, a fire that burned bright and true. But tonight, that fire had drawn the wrong kind of attention. As she sipped her coffee, the memories flooded back, of late nights spent working side by side, discussing cases, supporting each other through the ups and downs of their careers. They had built a life on a foundation of mutual respect, resilience, and a shared commitment to justice. And yet, here they were, vulnerable in the face of a system that saw her husband as a threat rather than a protector. Kira was startled out of her thoughts by a knock at the door. She jumped, her heart racing, as she rushed to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Benson, a kindly woman in her 60s who had known their family since they'd moved into the neighborhood. "Kira, I heard some commotion earlier. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Benson's voice was filled with genuine concern, her eyes searching Kira's face for answers. Kira forced a small, tense smile. It's a long story, Mrs. Benson. Jason was arrested tonight. They thought he was driving a stolen car, even though it was his own." Mrs. Benson's eyes widened in shock, and she reached out to place a comforting hand on Kira's arm. "Oh, my dear, that's terrible. Jason is such a good man. He's done so much for this community. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding." Kira nodded, feeling a pang of gratitude for the woman's kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Benson. We're doing everything we can to get him home. It's hard." Mrs. Benson patted her arm gently. "If there's anything you need, you just let me know. And tell Jason. Tell him we're all thinking of him. He's a hero to so many of us." After Mrs. Benson left, Kira returned to her seat by the window, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about getting Jason released. It was about making sure that this injustice was exposed, that people understood what had happened, not just to her husband, but to so many others who had suffered in silence. As dawn approached, the first light of morning casting a soft glow over the quiet street, Kira's phone rang again. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw it was a number she recognized. The direct line to the police station. "Hello," she answered, her voice taut with anticipation. "Kira, it's Detective Caldwell," the voice on the other end said, calm but laced with urgency. "I just wanted you to know that Jason is going to be released shortly. I've been working on this since I found out. I'll make sure he's brought home." Relief washed over Kira, her eyes filling with tears as she clutched the phone. "Thank you, Detective Caldwell. I don't know how to thank you. Just make sure he knows we'll get to the bottom of this. This isn't over." As she hung up, Kira felt a surge of hope mixed with a fierce determination. Jason would be home soon, but the fight was far from over. Together, they would stand up against this injustice, not just for themselves, but for every family that had endured this pain. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Kira felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that her family would be stronger for this, that they would use this experience to fuel their commitment to justice. For Jason, for their children, and for the countless others who needed someone to fight for them. The battle wasn't over, but they would face it together, stronger than ever. The release and unresolved tensions. The hours crept by slowly, and Jason's weariness was palpable. Sitting alone in the cold, dimly lit cell, he went through cycles of anger, sadness, and disbelief. As dawn broke and light seeped into the quiet police station, the sound of keys jingling outside his cell startled him. Detective Caldwell's face appeared behind the bars, his expression weary but resolute. "Jason," Caldwell said softly, unlocking the cell door. "It's time to get you home." Jason rose slowly, his body aching from the rough treatment the night before. He looked at Caldwell, his eyes a mixture of gratitude and the unspoken question. Why did this happen? He didn't voice it, though. Not here. Not yet. Detective Caldwell handed Jason his personal items, a silent apology in his demeanor. "You're free to go, Jason. And I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened." Jason took his belongings, his fingers brushing over his wallet, keys, and phone as though grounding himself in reality again. He nodded, but the words lodged in his throat. There was nothing he could say that would encompass the humiliation and anger he felt, or the fear that had gripped his heart when he thought of his family watching him taken away in handcuffs. "Let's get you home," Caldwell repeated gently, escorting him out of the station. Outside, Kira was waiting, pacing back and forth, her face tense with anxiety. The moment Jason stepped through the doors, she rushed to him, her eyes scanning him for any signs of harm. They embraced tightly, holding onto each other as though they might fall apart without the other's strength. "Kira," Jason murmured, brushing a hand against her cheek. I'm okay. I'm here. She pulled back slightly, her hands gripping his shoulders as if to anchor herself. I was so worried, Jason. The kids. Her voice broke, and she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay strong. They were terrified. They watched it all happen. Jason closed his eyes briefly, a pang of guilt and sorrow twisting in his chest. He had fought his whole life to protect his family, to shield them from the injustices he knew all too well. And now, right in front of his own home, those very injustices had found them. As they turned to leave, Detective Caldwell spoke up. Jason, please know we're taking this seriously. There will be an internal investigation. The officers responsible, they'll have to answer for their actions. Jason nodded, though he could feel the deep skepticism gnawing at him. He'd seen enough internal investigations to know how they often ended, with slaps on the wrist, quietly brushed aside without real consequences. As he and Kira walked toward their car, the detective's words echoed in his mind, but he refused to let them dull his resolve. There was a fire in him now, fueled by the humiliation, the pain, and the determination to protect others from going through what he had. Back at home, the house felt somber and heavy, the remnants of fear lingering in the air. Jordan and Maya rushed down the stairs the moment they heard their father's voice. Their small faces were etched with worry, and Jason's heart ached at the sight. "Daddy," Jordan cried, running into his arms. Maya followed, clutching his leg as though he might disappear again. Jason knelt down, hugging them both tightly. "I'm here, my loves. I'm not going anywhere." He fought to keep his voice steady, but his hands trembled as he held his children. In that moment, he made a silent promise to them that he would never let anything like this happen again. Not to him, and not to anyone else if he could help it. He looked up to see Kira standing nearby, watching them with a mixture of relief and quiet determination. She approached him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as the children finally pulled back, studying their father's face. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Maya asked, her little face full of innocence and concern. Jason managed a smile, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm okay because I have you, your mom, and your brother. That's all I need." The children eventually went back to their rooms, leaving Jason and Kira alone in the quiet living room. She sat beside him, taking his hand, her gaze searching his face. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Jason exhaled deeply, his mind racing with thoughts of the next steps. "I don't know," he admitted, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. "But I can't just let this go, Kira. Not after what they did." She nodded, her eyes fierce with sheer determination. "We won't let this go, Jason. We'll fight, together." They spent the rest of the morning discussing what had happened, reliving the terrifying night, and planning their next move. Kira suggested reaching out to local media outlets to shed light on what Jason had endured, while Jason considered the legal angles he could pursue. As an attorney, he knew the law inside out, but now he would use it in a personal battle, one that went beyond his clients and cases. Later that afternoon, Jason sat alone in his home office, staring at his computer screen, reviewing the details of other cases he had handled. Cases that had involved police misconduct, wrongful arrests, and the systemic biases that had plagued the city for decades. This was no longer just another case. This was his life, his family's dignity on the line. He drafted a statement, preparing to contact every media outlet he could think of. He would not let this incident remain hidden, buried under the usual bureaucratic protocols that allowed injustices to go unpunished. He wanted the world to know what had happened to him, not for pity, but for accountability. As he typed, his mind wandered to the other families he had represented, the clients who had been treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. He thought about the strength it took for them to face their traumas, to stand up in court and tell their stories. Now it was his turn. The phone rang, breaking his concentration. It was Detective Caldwell. "Jason, I wanted to let you know that we've initiated a formal review process, Caldwell said, his tone cautious but sincere. The officers involved have been placed on temporary leave, pending the outcome. Jason's jaw clenched, his skepticism evident. Detective, with all due respect, I've seen these processes before. I know how they end. I understand, Jason. But please know, some of us are genuinely trying to make a difference. We don't all stand by the behavior you experienced last night. There was a silence between them, filled with unspoken truths and a shared understanding of the flawed system they both operated within. Finally, Jason spoke. Thank you for calling, Detective. I appreciate your effort, but I need you to understand something. This is bigger than me. This is about a system that sees black men as threats before it sees them as human. I'm not going to rest until there's real change. Caldwell paused, then replied quietly, I hope you succeed, Jason. I really do. That evening, Jason sat with Kira on the back porch, the sun setting in hues of orange and purple. They held hands, feeling the weight of the day's events and the days yet to come. Jason could see the fire in Kira's eyes, a fierceness that matched his own. She had been his rock, his partner in every sense of the word. And he knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. We're going to do this, Kira whispered, her voice steady. For us, for our children, and for everyone who has to live with this fear. Jason nodded, a quiet strength settling within him. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long, hard fight. But with Kira by his side, he felt ready. The injustice he had faced would not break him. It would fuel him, drive him to make a difference. As darkness enveloped their home, they sat together, resolute in their shared purpose. For their family, for their community, and for the countless others who had been wronged, they would fight this battle. And they would not stop until justice was more than a word. It was a reality. The public outcry and legal maneuvers. Jason's ordeal had quickly become more than just a personal nightmare. It had ignited a firestorm. Kira had reached out to friends in the legal community, allies in civil rights organizations, and even local journalists. By morning, the news was spreading like wildfire, and Jason's story was beginning to take on a life of its own. Calls and messages flooded his inbox, some from supportive friends and colleagues, others from strangers who had faced similar experiences and wanted to stand with him. Sitting at his desk, Jason scrolled through the emails, his mind spinning from the overwhelming response. Every message seemed to underscore the same themes: outrage, solidarity, and an urgent demand for justice. His story was resonating with people from all walks of life, uniting them in a shared demand for accountability and reform. But for Jason, the path forward was clear. This couldn't end with social media hashtags or fleeting news coverage. He needed to bring about real, lasting change. Kira entered his office, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of him, her gaze steady and unwavering. People are responding, Jason, she said, her voice filled with both relief and determination. I spoke to the head of the local civil rights organization. They want to support us in any way they can. Jason took a sip of his coffee, nodding thoughtfully. I think it's time to go public with a formal statement, Kira. This story needs to be told in a way that doesn't just center on my experience, but sheds light on the larger problem. This is about every person who has ever been unfairly targeted or brutalized because of who they are. Kira reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We'll do this together. I've reached out to a journalist I trust. She's known for her integrity and doesn't sensationalize stories. If anyone can tell our story the right way, it's her. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. Going public in this way would mean inviting scrutiny, exposing himself and his family to a level of attention that could be overwhelming. But as he thought about the people who had written to him, their voices full of shared pain and experiences, he knew he couldn't back down. A few days later, Jason and Kira sat across from Claire Thompson, an investigative journalist known for her integrity and her deep dives into issues of social justice. They were meeting in a quiet cafe away from the public eye, where they could speak openly without interruptions. Claire leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook, her eyes intense and focused. "Jason, Kira, thank you for trusting me with this. I want you to know that my goal isn't just to tell your story, but to reveal the broader systemic issues. This isn't just a one-time incident. It's part of a pattern, and people need to see that." Jason nodded, grateful for her understanding. "Thank you, Claire. This is about so much more than what happened to me. The world needs to see how this kind of injustice affects real lives, real families." Kira placed her hand on Jason's, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "We want people to understand that this isn't just a story of victimhood. It's a story of resilience, of standing up against a system that has wronged too many people for far too long." For the next 2 hours, they recounted the events in excruciating detail, the humiliation, the fear, the pain of being targeted simply for existing in their own neighborhood. Claire listened intently, asking questions that allowed Jason and Kira to delve deeper into the emotional and psychological impact of the incident. By the end of the interview, Jason felt as though a weight had been lifted. He was no longer just a victim of injustice. He was an advocate, a man with a mission to bring about change. The following day, Claire's article hit the press, and it quickly went viral. Titled "Attorney's Harrowing Arrest in His Own Driveway," a stark reminder of racial profiling in America, the article captured every chilling detail of Jason's experience while contextualizing it within the broader framework of systemic discrimination and police misconduct. Readers across the country reacted with a mix of shock, anger, and empathy. The article was shared thousands of times, drawing attention from major news outlets, activists, and public figures. Some took to social media, using hashtags like #JusticeForJason and #EndRacial Profiling to amplify the story. Celebrities and politicians voiced their support, calling for accountability and demanding answers from the police department. Within days, a formal protest was organized outside the police station. People from all walks of life gathered, their signs held high, their voices united in a demand for justice. Jason watched the protests unfold on TV, a mixture of pride and disbelief in his expression. His story had become a catalyst, a rallying cry for change. But Jason knew that public outrage, while powerful, was not enough. True change required legal action, and he was ready to pursue it. Jason's legal team, composed of colleagues and friends who shared his commitment to justice, wasted no time in filing a lawsuit against the police department. The charges ranged from wrongful arrest to racial profiling, and the goal was clear: to hold the officers accountable and force the department to confront its ingrained biases. Kira stood by his side every step of the way, her unwavering support fueling his resolve. They both understood the challenges ahead. Taking on a police department was no small feat, and they would face backlash from those who saw Jason's actions as an attack on law enforcement. But they also knew that this was their moment, a chance to make a real difference. One evening, after a long day of strategizing with his legal team, Jason sat alone in his study, reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey had been exhausting, emotionally draining in ways he hadn't anticipated. Yet, as he thought about the people who had reached out to him, the messages of support from complete strangers, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His phone buzzed with a message from one of his clients, a young man named Marcus whom Jason had defended years ago. Marcus had been wrongfully accused of theft, and Jason had fought tirelessly to clear his name. The message read, "Mr. Carter, I saw your story. What happened to you was wrong, but I know you'll fight this just like you fought for me. Thank you for standing up for all of us." Jason's chest tightened as he read Marcus's words. This was why he was fighting. This was why he couldn't back down. The lawsuit, the public statements, the interviews, they weren't just about clearing his name. They were about challenging the system that had oppressed and marginalized people for far too long. The police department responded to the lawsuit with a mixture of defensiveness and denial, claiming that the officers had acted within protocol. They insisted that Jason's car had matched the description of a stolen vehicle in the area and that the officers had acted out of caution. But Jason's legal team was prepared. They presented a comprehensive case, highlighting not only the inconsistencies in the police department's claims, but also the documented history of racial profiling within the force. They uncovered records of previous complaints against the officers involved, painting a picture of a department rife with systemic issues that had been ignored for years. The case garnered national attention, and the courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and supporters. Jason sat beside his attorneys, his gaze steady as he listened to the arguments, his heart pounding with the weight of the moment. This was more than a trial. It was a battle for justice, a fight for dignity, and a stand against the prejudice that had torn his family apart. In the days that followed, the testimonies poured in. Neighbors testified to Jason's character, recounting how he had helped them with legal matters, always willing to lend a hand. Witnesses spoke about the officers' aggressive behavior, their disregard for Jason's rights. The evidence was overwhelming, and it became clear to everyone in the courtroom that Jason had been targeted simply because of the color of his skin. As the trial progressed, Jason felt a surge of hope. He could see the tide turning, the realization dawning on people's faces that this was not just about him, but about a system that had failed countless others. The day of the closing arguments arrived, and Jason's attorney spoke with conviction, her words powerful and unyielding. She reminded the court that this was a chance to set a precedent, to show that no one was above the law, and that every citizen deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. When the verdict was finally read, the room fell silent. The judge ruled in Jason's favor, citing the overwhelming evidence of racial profiling and wrongful arrest. The police department was ordered to issue a public apology, and the officers involved were suspended pending further investigation. Jason's heart swelled with relief and gratitude, but he knew that this victory was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but he had taken a stand, and his story had sparked a movement. As he left the courtroom, surrounded by supporters and loved ones, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Looking into the eyes of his family, his friends, and the strangers who had come to support him, Jason made a silent promise. He would continue this fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that refused to see them. He was not alone, and together they would keep pushing, keep fighting, until justice was more than an ideal. It was a reality, a new dawn, and the path forward. The courtroom victory was a monumental moment. But Jason knew that one case, one ruling, was not enough to change the entrenched systems of injustice. As he stood outside the courthouse, the morning sunlight casting a golden hue over the gathered crowd, he felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him. Supporters, journalists, activists, and fellow attorneys surrounded him, applauding his courage and resilience. Yet, as Jason scanned the sea of faces, he was all too aware that the fight for true justice and equality was far from over. Kira joined him on the steps, her hand warm and reassuring in his. They exchanged a glance, an unspoken acknowledgement that this battle had brought them closer than ever. Jason knew that Kira's unwavering support had been his anchor through the darkest moments. She had held their family together, balanced the demands of his career, and championed his innocence when everything seemed to fall apart. As reporters began shouting questions, Jason held up his hand, signaling for quiet. He felt the collective hush of anticipation as all eyes focused on him, awaiting his words. Today was a victory, he began, his voice carrying a calm yet powerful conviction. But I want to be clear, this victory is not just mine. This is a win for every person who has been unfairly judged, mistreated, or marginalized. This is for every black man, woman, and child who has been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. Today, we stand together to say, enough. The crowd erupted in applause, but Jason didn't let the celebration distract him from his message. He paused, allowing the moment to settle, before continuing. For years, I believed that justice was simply about following the law, about fighting cases in courtrooms. But this experience has opened my eyes to the depth of change that needs to happen beyond the legal arena. True justice means reforming the very structures that allow prejudice to flourish unchecked. True justice is about making sure that my children, and all children, grow up in a world where they are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. A tear slipped down Kira's cheek as she listened, feeling the gravity of his words. This was the man she had fallen in love with, the man whose passion and dedication to justice had inspired her from the very beginning. Now, more than ever, she was reminded of why their journey together was so powerful. They were more than a family. They were partners in a larger mission to build a world where justice was a promise, not a privilege. As Jason stepped down from the podium, various activists and community leaders approached him, offering words of support and encouragement. Among them was Dr. Lena Mitchell, a renowned civil rights advocate who had long campaigned for police reform. She extended a warm handshake and a knowing smile. "Jason," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "you've done something incredible today. But as you know, this is only the beginning. We have a long road ahead of us." Jason nodded, already feeling the gears of change turning in his mind. "I know, Dr. Mitchell. I want to take this further. We need comprehensive police reform, accountability, and a system that protects everyone, regardless of their background." Dr. Mitchell's eyes gleamed with approval. "We could use someone like you on our team. There's a coalition forming, a group of activists, lawyers, and community leaders pushing for legislative change. We could use your voice, your legal expertise." Jason glanced at Kira, who nodded encouragingly. This was exactly what he needed to do. He had already made an impact in the courtroom, but now it was time to step onto the larger stage and address the root of the problem. In the weeks that followed, Jason found himself fully immersed in a movement that was gaining momentum across the country. Alongside Dr. Mitchell and other prominent activists, he began working on a police reform bill that aimed to establish clearer accountability standards, mandate de-escalation training, and create a database to track officers with histories of misconduct. The work was grueling. Endless meetings, late nights spent drafting proposals, countless debates and compromises. Jason threw himself into it with the same dedication he had shown in the courtroom, knowing that every detail mattered. His story continued to inspire others, drawing attention to the urgent need for reform. During this time, Jason's family remained his foundation. Jordan and Maya, his young children, were too young to fully understand the significance of their father's work, but they sensed the importance of what he was doing. Kira continued to balance her own advocacy work while supporting Jason's relentless pursuit of justice. At night, they would sit together, discussing the day's events and offering each other words of encouragement. Their shared vision for a better world fueled them, giving them the strength to keep pushing forward, even when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. Months later, Jason found himself standing before a packed assembly room at the state legislature. He had been asked to testify in support of the police reform bill he had helped draft. The room was filled with lawmakers, journalists, and members of the public, all eager to hear his testimony. As he began to speak, Jason recounted his experience, not just as a black man wrongfully arrested, but as a father, a husband, and an attorney who had dedicated his life to justice. He described the fear in his children's eyes, the feeling of helplessness as he was treated like a criminal in his own driveway. His voice shook as he relayed the depth of his humiliation, but he held his head high, knowing that his story had the power to change minds. "This bill is not about weakening law enforcement," he concluded. "It's about ensuring that law enforcement upholds its duty to protect and serve everyone equally. It's about making sure that no one has to experience what I did simply because of their skin color. This is a chance for us to build a system that reflects the best of our values, a system rooted in justice, fairness, and equality." When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, The lawmakers began to applaud. Jason's words had struck a chord, resonating deeply with everyone present. In that moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. Real change was possible, and he was part of it. The police reform bill faced its share of challenges: opposition from certain factions, amendments that threatened to dilute its impact, but Jason and his allies fought tirelessly to preserve its core provisions. With the support of activists, community leaders, and a growing coalition of lawmakers, they managed to push the bill through. The day the bill was signed into law, Jason stood by Dr. Mitchell, Kira, and other advocates, his heart swelling with pride. He knew that this was just one victory in a much larger struggle, but it was a significant step forward. This law would not erase the trauma he had endured, nor would it bring immediate justice to all who had been wronged. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which they could build a more equitable future. Months later, as he sat with Kira in their living room, watching Jordan and Maya play, Jason reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. His family had endured so much, but they had emerged stronger, bound by a shared commitment to justice and resilience. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for Kira, whose love and support had been his lifeline. He knew that their story would serve as a beacon of hope for others facing similar battles. Jason's phone buzzed with a notification, a message from Dr. Mitchell, congratulating him on the bill's passage and inviting him to speak at an upcoming conference on criminal justice reform. Smiling, he set the phone down, turning his attention back to his family. As he watched his children, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought for them, for their future, for a world where they wouldn't have to fear the kind of injustice he had endured. And he knew that the fight would continue, not just in courtrooms or legislative halls, but in every conversation, every community, and every heart willing to embrace change. Jason Carter had found his purpose, his voice amplified by the countless voices that had stood with him. Together, they would continue the journey toward a world where justice was not just an aspiration, but a reality for all.